recording here. I'm really excited to be able to present today on what OCD is in honor of OCD Awareness Week, which is happening all throughout this week. So I'm going to share my screen and we can get started with discussing about what OCD is. So I believe my screen should be sharing now. Okay, I am screen sharing. So before we hop in, we're just going to take a second to talk about what people think OCD is. So I did a little survey among some of my friends and family, and we took a look at what most people thought OCD was. So a word or phrase that came to their mind immediately when they thought about OCD. And I'm going to share some of those answers with you, some of the top ones that came up. Oh, there we go. So some of the things that came to mind when people were talking about OCD, the word controlling came up a lot. The word cleaning, micromanaging, double checking, fixation, paranoia, those were all a few of those words that came up when discussing OCD. So what is obsessive-compulsive disorder? Let's take a second and define that. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a disorder where people experience intrusive thoughts. So these are thoughts that can get stuck in your mind and be very stressful, as well as ideas or sensations that they don't really want to be having. And this experience can make the person feel driven to perform a certain behavior repetitively to combat those intrusive thoughts. So just to be clear, OCD is a serious mental disorder. It's not something that you could turn on and off at will. It's definitely not a convenience. And as the name would suggest, obsessive-compulsive disorder is comprised of two major factors, obsessions and compulsions. So let's talk about obsessions. What are they and how do they come about? An obsession is what we would call those unwanted, intrusive thoughts, feelings, or sensations. And these obsessions can manifest in so many different ways. And that would depend on the individual, their experiences, cultural backgrounds, their values, all of that. And obsessions are typically related to a core fear or a deep-seated worry that the individual would have. So it's important to note that every single person has intrusive thoughts. It's a part of the human experience, and in many cases, these thoughts can be useful in helping us process things, keeping us safe. And these thoughts can randomly just pop up in your head. It doesn't really matter what you're doing or when, they're just thoughts that can emerge. So it's just the way our brains work. Everyone experiences them. But in the case of OCD, these are not just excessive worries. We can begin to classify these intrusive thoughts as an obsession when it's consuming an individual's time and causing them heightened, disturbed distress. So OCD can fall into many different categories, obsessions can fall into many different categories. And there are a few popular ones that I have up here, and we're going to go over them. So an individual may have an obsession stemming from fear such as harming themselves or harming another person, checking things out of fear that something will happen, something harmful or bad to other people, a desire for symmetry and orderliness so that things will feel balanced and controlled. And with contamination, an individual may have fears of being dirty or impure. And this can be both physical in terms of germs on your hands, or this could be mental in terms of having pure thoughts. And finally, intrusive thought, obsessions, can include distressing and frequent violent or sexual thoughts and images. Okay, so let's jump to that second element of OCD, which are compulsions. So a compulsion is a repetitive behavior that an individual is engaging in as a way to try and remove that intrusive thought that is coming to them. And compulsions can take many forms and are often related to the obsessions. So they can be influenced by one's cultural background and the norms and values in their family, just like we saw with obsessions. So these compulsions can include things like checking things over and over, mental compulsions such as repeating a prayer or a phrase or a mantra in one's head, constantly seeking reassurance. There's washing and cleaning rituals, such as having a specific hand washing sequence that goes well beyond what would be considered just a person who really values their personal hygiene. And then we have ordering and counting rituals or compulsions, which could include putting things into certain sequences in terms of numbers or letters, or performing behaviors that they believe will ward off certain superstitions, things like that. And then there's rituals, such as sequences for locking and unlocking something, or mental rituals, so a thought process that one would go through in their mind. So we know that the interaction between obsessions and compulsions is what we call obsessive-compulsive disorder. But how exactly does this interaction go down? This interaction is what we would call the OCD cycle. And we're going to take a second right now and explore how that OCD cycle works. So in the OCD cycle, we start off with an obsession, which you'll see right at the top. And an obsession, as we discussed, is one of those recurring intrusive thoughts or sensations, and this thought or idea is very distressing to the individual. So because of this obsession, it becomes so difficult to deal with that an individual has a spike in anxiety. They experience immense fear regarding their thought, and they become worried, and they start to question themselves. This anxiety becomes so difficult to deal with that the individual engages in a compulsion. So some sort of repetitive behavior, mental behavior, or ritual that they believe will help them reduce some of that anxiety. So once that compulsion has been completed, the individual does experience some relief. And I want to highlight that this relief is very fleeting. So it doesn't solve the fear problem. It doesn't make their anxiety go away for good, but just for a moment, they might feel better after doing that compulsion. But what ends up happening is the obsession, will just come back, and the individual goes through the cycle over and over again. And as you can imagine, with this cycle continuing on and on, it's very frustrating and very draining for that individual. So when we're conceptualizing this cycle, it's important for us to remember that this can take up a whole lot of time. Some could spend a huge chunk of their time in that obsession phase, or maybe they're going to be anxiety driven for a while and very confused and worried about their obsession, or they might take a massive chunk of their time engaging in that compulsion. And this is something that can, like I said, you can be stuck in one part of the cycle for a long time. You could go through the cycle a lot of times in a day, but in general, it is just a very exhausting experience to go through. Okay, so now that we know that individuals with OCD experience intrusive thoughts, and we also know that every human being experiences intrusive thoughts. So what is it in the individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder that causes them to have obsessive compulsive disorder? Why don't we all have this disorder? So some of the things that we can look to, considering there's no actual written out in stone, this is what causes obsessive compulsive disorder. There are some things that research point to, such as biological factors, genetic factors, and environmental factors that we can all look to as playing a role in the development of OCD. And we're going to go through some of those right now. So some of the big ticket items that research looks at when exploring what causes OCD would include neurobiology, cognitive and behavioral factors, and autoimmunity. And we're going to unpack each one of those as well. So one of the first things that we can look to understand what causes OCD is neurobiology, or how the brain is wired. So OCD has been linked to issues surrounding neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine. And in addition to that, research has also pointed to certain brain structures that they believe to play a role in the manifestation of obsessive compulsive disorder. So in terms of neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine are the big ones. And research has demonstrated that neurotransmitter dysregulation, so what they might call irregular levels of certain serotonin or dopamine levels in your brain are something that we can look to. So low levels of serotonin have been considered to be a part of OCD, as well as higher levels of dopamine. And there is a lot of research on exactly how that works. Again, it's kind of things that keep being discovered and understood. And then we can also look to, in addition to those neurotransmitters, the certain brain structures. So there are 4 different structures of the brain that are believed to play a bigger role in obsessive compulsive disorder. So the first 2 are the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. And the orbitofrontal cortex, that's kind of a tongue twister, is involved in decision making, and the anterior cingulate cortex is involved in feeling empathy, impulse control, emotion, and decision making. And those are both structures located towards the front of one's brain. Then we have towards the inner, deeper parts of the brain, the striatum and the thalamus. And the striatum is responsible for that voluntary movement, decision making, and motivation, just to name a few things. And the thalamus is a really big part of our brain. It's not necessarily in terms of size, but it's kind of where all the information processing goes through into the brain. So it's kind of like the control center. Okay, so next we can take a look at some of those cognitive and behavioral factors. So in general, research believes that obsessions and compulsions arise out of certain types of dysfunctional beliefs. So an individual could be experiencing intrusive thoughts. Any individual can experience those thoughts. But for those diagnosed with OCD, these thoughts might develop into those obsessions if they believe they're thought to be extremely important, threatening, or hold some sort of moral weight. In addition to those dysfunctional beliefs leading to obsessions, positive enforcement also plays a big role in causing the obsession and compulsion cycle to go on. So if somebody has in their head, one of those obsessions and they're so worried about it, their anxiety spikes up, they head to the compulsion stage of the OCD cycle like we looked at, and they realize, hey, that worked. That helped my anxiety go down. I feel a lot better. It has suddenly been positively reinforced in their brain. So while that behavior didn't really do much for them, it kind of helped lower the anxiety for the time being. In their mind, it helps. This is what we're going to do every single time we have this fear or worry. So moving on to autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is another concept that has been brought up when trying to understand what causes OCD. And specifically, we can look at streptococcal infections. So this is things like strep throat, scarlet fever, and this has been found specifically in children, so pediatric populations, that when they do get these streptococcal infections, they suddenly have, almost as it would appear, overnight symptoms of OCD just arising, or that OCD symptoms would worsen in a child who already had the diagnosis. And this type of OCD is what we refer to as pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections, otherwise known as PANDAS, otherwise known as a very long tongue twister. But PANDAS is actually able to be treated with antibiotics. Okay, so we've learned a lot about what OCD is. So let's now talk about what this disorder affects. Who is affected by this diagnosis? And one of the most important things that I can say today is that OCD does not discriminate. Any gender, any race, any age, and any cultural background can be affected by this disorder. And it's important that we realize that. In Canada, 1% to 2% of the population has been diagnosed with OCD. So that's over 337,000 individuals, which in the grand scheme of things, you might think, oh, I don't know how big that number is, but it's actually a lot when we think about the fact that there's a lot of people that have not been diagnosed yet. Maybe they don't realize that they have that problem. And also just that the disorder is not talked about a lot. And there's this huge group of individuals who are living through this and are probably not getting the support that they need. So OCD can affect individuals of any age, so children, adolescents, and adults. But we typically notice that the onset of the disorder happens in early childhood up to late adolescence, early adulthood. OCD has a very big impact both on the diagnosed individual and on those close relationships surrounding that individual. So, for the diagnosed individual, they could be overcome with constant fear, anxiety, and worry. And a lot of the things that they would normally like to do, they can't do anymore. They live in a constant state of uncertainty, and a lot of the time they are consumed with obsessive thoughts and hours of compulsions to combat the thoughts, and they're just trapped in that cycle that we looked at earlier. Their ability to function at school, at work, or with other individuals is often also impacted. And now, taking a look at those close relationships, they're also heavily affected by this diagnosis. So, when the effects of OCD become apparent within a relationship or in a friendship or the home, it can be very consuming. OCD kind of tends to take control of what's going on. So, significant others and family members could really feel frustrated or resentful, uncomfortable, and even as though they're scared that what they do is going to aggravate the situation or make it worse. And that, of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, would be very exhausting for somebody. So, a big question that comes up with OCD after we consider what it is, who it can affect, is can this be treated? And is this something that I can learn to manage in my everyday life? And the great news is that it totally can. With the proper treatment measures and support systems, individuals with OCD are able to learn to overcome some of those fears and live through that diagnosis and not let it overshadow everything they do. So, there are two paths to treatment that are typically taken with OCD, and that would either be psychotherapy, medication, or some sort of combination of those two elements. So, talking about psychotherapy, we typically look to cognitive behavioral therapy as it has been demonstrated to be helpful in individuals living with this diagnosis. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, there's a specific therapy that has been found to be extremely useful to individuals living with OCD, and that would be exposure response prevention therapy, or ERP. And the premise of ERP is that an individual would be exposed to a sphere, an obsession, or some sort of trigger. And the response prevention takes effect as the individual learns to resist their desires to engage in that behavior or that ritual that they would typically do to get rid of that anxiety or fear. Basically, the ERP teaches people to fight through that anxiety and to deal with that uncertainty rather than to just succumb to it and start engaging in those compulsions that they think are going to help them feel better. Now, ERP therapy is a lot of work, considering that the individual has to be very engaged and motivated to face their fears head on and to learn to deal with that stress and that anxiety. But it is definitely possible. A good support system is always necessary and important. Having people around them who are willing to work with them through this diagnosis and through this form of treatment is always helpful. And just again to highlight, ERP doesn't take away the fear or the obsession, but what it does is that it helps the individual learn to work through it and learn that they don't need to engage in a compulsion and that they will still be safe and that things will not fall apart as they might think it would if they don't succumb to that obsession. Okay, now we could talk about medication, which is another way that OCD is typically treated, and that is usually seen through antidepressants. So we have popular ones like Zoloft, Prozac, those types of things. Um, and there are some very important implications to consider when thinking about using medication, both for OCD as well as for any disorder in general. And one of those would be the side effects. So the individual would need to be aware of and prepared to deal with those side effects from the medication, as well as the interactions between the medication and other substances, such as like alcohol. And again, with both medication and therapy, it's important for an individual to realize that things don't just happen overnight. It takes time, it takes work, and it takes consistency. But there's definitely the possibility of getting to a much better place than you started out in. And a lot of individuals actually find that medication and ERP therapy or some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy combined are a really great way for them to manage OCD as well. Okay, so we're coming down to the end of our time today. And I think that considering it is OCD Awareness Week, a great thing for us to talk about would be, how can I raise awareness on OCD? What can you do in your daily life to make sure that this is being talked about? So when we talk about awareness, we first need to be aware of where we learned about OCD. So as I mentioned earlier, I did a survey canvassing some of my friends and family to find out what they thought about OCD, where they learned about it. And I'm going to share some of those things that people said were the top areas they learned about OCD from. So a lot of people said that they learned about OCD from their friends, from the media, so whether social media or traditional media, and from entertainment, and specifically movies. And if you think about it, this is not the most broad learning environment, right? Because with friends, it's hearsay. She said this, he said that. It's not always a friend who has lived with OCD. So sometimes it can kind of take a turn and not be fully accurate. The media is not always the best to look at to try to learn some of these things as well. And entertainment, movies tend to blow OCD out of proportion. So 83% of the people that I surveyed felt that OCD was not adequately highlighted in discussions of mental illness. So, considering that narrow scope where people are learning just from the entertainment, media, and friends, and on top of it, 83% of people are saying, hey, OCD isn't talked about a lot, I don't know much about it. There's definitely that need for all of us to be raising awareness on OCD and how to help individuals with this disorder. So let's discuss some of those ways that we can be an ally. We can offer our support to the OCD community, and how we can just make sure that we are not perpetuating harmful stereotypes um, or stigmas. So a major step to becoming an ally is to talk about OCD experiences openly. So let's stop treating OCD like something that we're not supposed to talk about, or something that we're supposed to joke about. And instead, if you know an individual with OCD, ask them to share their story. Make sure that you're actively listening to what they have to say to you. And if you have OCD and you're comfortable, it's okay to talk about it. Talking about OCD normalizes the disorder, and it allows people to learn more about it. So this doesn't have to be a huge public speaking level type event, but let your friends and family know, if you're comfortable, that you've been diagnosed with OCD. And if they have questions about it, they can come to you and ask. That way they're getting truthful information. Okay, the next thing that you can do to become an ally is to view mental health and physical health on the same landscape, the same way, as equals. So a big part of why there's little awareness on disorders, I'm a little tongue-tied, such as OCD, is because people esteem physical health over mental health. So by acknowledging that both are equally important, and then taking those steps to have those important conversations with others who have OCD, you're actually able to begin raising some of that awareness on the disorder. Another way we can get to be an ally for the OCD community is to get children involved. And this, I think, is one of my favorite ones, because kids can be affected by OCD just like adults can. A child might have a friend in the classroom who has OCD. They might be the child with OCD. And it is never too early to start getting kids aware of certain disorders and things that they're going to face in life that they can help make better. So a great way to do this, to get your kids involved, is to do some reading resources, to get them to be highlighting OCD stories and voices, hearing about those experiences, and have it be normalized for them at a young age. So if you want some ideas for books for kids and young adults that focus on OCD, you could actually check out the @OCD North Instagram page. And there's going to be a post going up this week on some reading resources. So check that out. That's a great way to get kids starting to learn and talk about OCD. Okay, you can become an ally by getting normalizing getting help when you have a problem. So, a lot of people have a hard time going to therapy or getting extra support when experiencing OCD. So if you see a loved one is struggling, or if you yourself are struggling, um, just know that it is definitely okay to get some help. It is okay to bring someone to get some help if they're okay with that. But just letting people know that, hey, it's okay. I want to support you. I want you to be better. I want you to feel better. And it's okay to get extra professional help with that. That is a great way to be an ally. And finally, we can be allies by speaking up and sharing the knowledge that we have. So if you hear somebody making a joke about OCD, in culture, popular culture, it's very trivialized. If somebody doesn't like something a certain way, they'll say, "Oh, I'm so OCD." If you hear people making jokes like that, call them out on it. Let them know that that's not okay, that there are people who actually live with that disorder, and that you trivializing it can be very harmful. In addition, sharing that knowledge that you gain in your own research can be so helpful. And this can be as simple as sharing a post on Instagram or Facebook or something like that. But it definitely starts to normalize the OCD disorder and allow people to understand more about it and to themselves become allies. So, we're going to end off our time today with a bigger question, which is how to support a loved one with OCD. And we're going to do this in a don't versus do type of style. So, first up, we have don't offer reassurance, which can sound kind of interesting when you first hear it. But reassurance, in terms of if somebody shares that they have a fear and you say, don't worry about that, like that's crazy, don't worry, stop thinking about it, that can be reassurance, like, oh, that would never happen. But also engaging in a compulsion with somebody. So, you're washing your hands with somebody to try to help them calm down. Those things only offer temporary relief. The sufferer's compulsion will be fed and they'll mostly fall right back into that OCD cycle that we talked about. So instead of offering reassurance, you can encourage them to seek help. OCD is thankfully able to be treated. So getting somebody help, telling them that you support them while they're going through therapy, that can really encourage somebody and let them realize that it is okay to get that help that they need. Our second don't when trying to support a loved one with OCD is don't try to relate. So by trying to relate or compare your fears to that of an individual with OCD, they can feel like their experience is being minimized. They may not they may feel very hurt by that. It could be very trivializing and, again, just harmful in general. So instead of trying to relate your experiences and compare your experiences to that of the individual with OCD, something that you can do is educate yourself. And we've talked about this a bit already, but by educating yourself, you're able to become more aware of some of those stigmas, become aware of what is helpful and what is harmful, and you're able to stop perpetuating things that could be hurtful to the one that you love. And our third don't when supporting a loved one with OCD is don't encourage avoidance. So, trying to avoid an intrusive thought typically makes someone think about it more. So, if I were to say to you, try not to think about pink elephants, suddenly you're thinking about pink elephants and it's all you can think about. And it's kind of the same thing when dealing with OCD. If somebody has a fear and you tell them, oh, just like ignore it, pretend it's not there, it could make them start thinking about it a lot more. And on the other side of that, it can also really trivialize what they're thinking, because OCD is not a pleasant experience. So if they were already stressed about something and you tell them just stop thinking about it, they've probably tried that already. So instead of encouraging avoidance, which just kind of trivializes what they're going through, what you can do instead is encourage embracing uncertainty. And embracing uncertainty is kind of the other side of the coin when we're talking about avoidance. So it's best to help that individual face their fear head on. When they voice a fear, instead of trying to engage in a compulsion with them or offer them some reassurance, kind of approach it with a who knows mentality. So if they're afraid to get into the car because they think they're going to die, you could say, well, who knows what's going to happen, but we can try it together. This can be really hard to do, but it will help stop you from reinforcing those fears that they already possess. And so then you're helping them with some of those tools that they're going to need in order to conquer OCD long term. Okay, I want to thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you for listening on what OCD is and how you can be an ally to this underrepresented community. If you'd like more resources on where you can learn about OCD, resources for reading, just things that you can share, I encourage you to check out www.ocdnorth.com. There is a blog. You can also, if you feel that you do need help, you do need therapy, um, you could check out all the resources there. You could book a session. And if you want to get some more shareable resources for things that you could share on your social media, I would also encourage you to check out at OCD North on Instagram. There will also be a live stream on Friday at 1 p.m. on the at OCD North Instagram, where you can ask any live questions that you have about OCD, any questions that you had from today's session, or questions that you've just thought about in general. So if you have any questions, you could also leave them in the comments of any one of the recent posts on the OCD North Instagram or the post on today's webinar, and those questions could get answered in Friday's live stream. So again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And let me stop sharing. Okay, thank you.